Cause like I always, hey, this is Chiron's Cave and I'm Aaron. And, it's like, then we say bye at the end and then the episode gets cut up into 2 episodes. And then it's like, well, what's the point of all that? So I'm just like, well, we'll just start recording and from now on and I'll edit or just put it however it is. So anyway, so this has been Hudson, our guest today on Chiron's Cave. He is also known as Ben the Vegan Farmer. I guess, is that a TikTok handle or is that?
Yeah, it's my social media like handles. I also use that for my website and stuff. But yeah, it's just a catchy like SEO title.
Cool. So did you want to introduce yourself to our listeners? Just a little bit about who you are and how you came to be here on this show?
Yeah, definitely. For sure. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and learn a bit more about astrology. Me and Aaron are pretty good friends. We've been hanging out and had met through the farmer's market. I'm also obviously a farmer, been the vegan farmer. So I do veganic farming. But before I was a farmer, I was actually in the technology industry. So I worked in the software industry for about 10 years. So my background's definitely heavy in the like science aspect. I'm also really passionate about like philosophy and ethics as well. So a lot of my studies now are kind of focused on ethics. And yeah, I'm really excited to speak with you both today and learn a little bit more about astrology and the different perspectives here.
Awesome.
Cool. Did you want to say anything, Susan?
Welcome. That's awesome. Just we're glad to have you here for the conversation, and that's really cool that you're interested in philosophy also. And I've heard a little about you, and so I knew that perhaps there had been some conversations between you and Aaron about the nature of reality, as such the conversation today may yield, but and that astrology is very different, perhaps as like a lens or worldview than what you're used to and what your background is. And I actually have a background in critical theory, and philosophy is a big part of that. And so
Very
it
cool.
sounds like there's maybe some overlap between how you see the world maybe and how I do, but I'm also, and how Aaron does. I'm curious. I definitely have curiosity about your perspective on things, and I'm very much far leaning as a the language arts and language as a tool for the construction of meaning, as astrology as well. And I have not religious beliefs, but I have a spiritual practice, and so but I see largely through my first lens was sort of a philosophical one, and I still kind of go to that. So and we talk a lot about that in terms of what is astrology and how does it make meaning. And so I just am kind of interested in where everything's gonna how it's gonna connect today. So yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the proposed sort of focus for this episode is going to be the nature of reality, and that's likely what it'll probably be, the nature of reality, episode 1 and 2. So, and I have prepared an outline for this discussion. My expectations are not so much that we're going to follow the outline. I mean, who knows where this is going to go? I know, like me and Susan, Ben and I are similar in conversation. Like, we can just go on and on and on and on and on and on and just never run out of stuff to talk about. And that's, Ben, that's kind of how me and Susan are the same. Obviously we have a podcast together, so it's like, we can talk. So I'm really excited to have the three of us here. And so just the outline I prepared, because you guys have both seen the notes, and I'm not like attached to it or anything. It's just, we're going to go wherever we go. It's just there to kind of guide us in the event we need it. So what I kind of want to do is let's just start on that. I'll just read some points and we'll see where it goes. But I would like to be sure that we get to Ben's chart, his nativity, which, Susan, I know you you're not, you feel the same way.
Yeah.
Like this Chiron's cave, like it is centered on psychological archetypal astrology. So it's kind of our focus.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
nature of reality. So the where I started with this is with time. So time is central to our experience of reality. And so it's relative, right? It's relative to planet Earth in several ways. Earth, sun, and moon. So, and this is just reality, right? Like the diurnal rotation, the Earth's rotational speed, right, defines our experience of day and night. All life on Earth lives by that rhythm. And but then it's further because that's day and night. So that's a Earth Sun relationship, right? But then a month then is Earth Moon relationship, Earth, Moon, stars, right? So then the year, right, is Earth and Sun and stars, right? And so the combination of all three of those things is you see in the synodic month, which is the phases of the moon, because there's sidereally, so the moon itself to return to the same stars in the sky, so one orbit around the Earth, right, is 27 days and some change. It's like 27.22 or something like that. Synodic, though, so from phase to phase, so full moon to full moon, it's an extra 2 and some change days. So the moon has to catch up. So there's two. So there's essentially, by sidereal reckoning, there is 13 moons in a year. But synodically, there's 12. So how we experience the moon as what we see is phases of the moon. There's 12 of those in a year. That relationship is truly sun, moon, earth. All three, and stars, right? Like all three of those things come together. So it's more than just a month as far as like a 12th of a year, right? It's an actual experience of the moon itself. And so I've gone all over the place there, but just so I was trying to talk about the relativity of time, right, on Earth. It kind of went all over the place with that. But so, what is so interesting to me is this idea of time being relative. And later on in the notes, actually, I go into Saturn, and I talk about, let's see here. Let me see here. Yeah. So this is interesting. I'm jumping way ahead just to hit this point. So Saturn's cycle is 29.4 years, right? So Saturn's orbit is 29.4 years long. So for Saturn to return to the same stars, it's 29.4 years. So, but 1 year on Saturn is equal to 29.4 years on Earth. So if you were on Saturn, 1 year experienced on Saturn would be 29.4 years on Earth. So if I were to live on Saturn for 46 years, my age approximately, a couple of weeks I'm going to turn 46. If I were to live 46 years on Saturn, I would live for 1,352.4 years on Earth because of the relativity of time, right? Because a year on Saturn is worth 29 years on Earth. So it's kind of my window into looking at, trying to understand this idea of the relativity of time. Because we experience it as a real thing. But what would it mean to live on another planet and experience time differently? And what does that mean for reality?
Yeah.
So I'll stop talking now. Whoever wants to pick up there.
Oh, that's easy. I can answer that.
I would just say No, from a scientific perspective, yeah, I think, it's important to like recognize that time is like a relationship. So it is very much relative. And like from a human perspective, as minds or as agents interpreting, time, it is about change. It's how we record change. And it's like the foundation of how we recognize patterns. So I think, yeah, I mean, expanding from that, yeah, I think time is obviously one of the most important things for extracting meaning out of existence, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's
And to
well
and,
said.
and to just add to that, motion, right? Because the thing is, with orbital periods, with day night, with our experience of time, right? It's about motion. No, you never think about time as motion, but that's where it
Yep.
becomes interesting to me, and where you can kind of start talking about things like astrology, because that what astrology is about, the motions of the planets, and the meaning of that. So
Yeah.
I'm always constantly, I feel like how Carl Jung and Freud must have felt when they were creating psychology as a study, right? Because it's like they wanted to be taken seriously by science. They wanted it to be science, right? But it was seen as like almost like woo, right? Like it's not science, the study of the mind. And that's how I constantly feel with astrology. It's like I constantly feel like it is intellectual, and I gotta prove that to everybody, because it's not just woo, but it certainly is woo in a lot of ways to a lot of people also. So it's just this, yeah, I feel like I'm like fighting for astrology like Freud and Jung were fighting for psychology to be taken seriously.
Hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing about that I would maybe ask, just to kind of give myself some context and maybe um, situate it within, perhaps previous conversations that you guys have had. And I think just to kind of give this in overview, that the conversation between maybe people who think that astrology is absolute bunk and people who practice astrology, that conversation has been happening, debate, and even sometimes really vitriolic, like a lot of almost hostile conversations and debates about one or the other. It's like between the two, it's this idea that there has to be one that is true and one that isn't. And so, the validity of astrology, I can certainly understand, Aaron, like that impulse to like validate astrology as as it stands, or as you are understanding it and exploring it. But one question I would maybe ask, to since you all have probably had these conversations, but to ask to Ben, is like, do you feel, Ben, like there is a need, or uh like that the validity of astrology is absolute like bunk? Like, kind of, what are your, just in a nutshell, like what would you say your perspective is, if that's not putting you too much on the spot?
No, yeah, not at all. And I think this is something Aaron and I have talked a lot about in private. I definitely see a lot of benefit in astrology in the like symbolic sense, right? And also in the like importance of as humans recognizing patterns in nature.
Hmm.
I think those are both like foundationally very important things.
Mhm.
So I guess where I would start to draw the line of like skepticism
Uh-huh.
is applying descriptive, things like saying, some orbital pattern to causality. For me in like philosophy studies
Mhm.
right now, studying meta ethics, I'm trying to figure out how to overcome what's called the is ought gap. Right. So just because there is a truth, why ought we, draw some prescriptive or inscriptive meaning from it?
Mhm.
And that's always the hot topic, I think, or dilemma in these kind of philosophy discussions is like, okay, here's something we might can define as true. What do we draw from that? And I think, as humans, we have this drive towards recognizing these patterns, and trying to figure out these patterns and draw meaning from them. And I think that pursuit in and of itself is important. But where we kind of draw those causality or kind of inscriptions from that reality or recognizing, I think that's where my like skepticism comes into it as, a scientific mind. I'm like, that's where we need to challenge, right? Like, how do we prove these things empirically? Like, so as a scientific mind, that's I think where my skepticism comes in. But at the same time, I can recognize like the reality of the important, for humans to search for meaning.
Right.
And the reality of these like, physics that are a reality, that we should be exploring. So I guess I'm kind of in the middle there.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I was curious because, as the way you were introduced, the vegan farmer, and I think, I think Aaron has mentioned that you might be. Are you atheist? Like, would you say that that's you?
I would say agnostic. I mean, I definitely grew up, religious, but the more I studied other religions and spirituality, history, psychology, all of that, the less I became. I became less spiritual, I would say, and more just like agnostic and a skeptic, just in general.
Right.
But that's kind of how I've always been as a skeptic. I really enjoy the pursuit of truth. And questioning things. I think in one of the videos I was catching up, Aaron was talking about like pulling the rug out, from the foundations of people's framework, not in like a mean way, but just in a like, that's how I am, like I want to challenge these things. I want to test your framework. So that's kind of how I am as well. And it's not to be like, rude or as Aaron said, I think pee on the rug, but it's because I think the pursuit of these truths and the debate around them, I think, help us come to more truths and better meaning, and I think that's important. So
love that. Yeah, that's awesome. Same. I love that, and thank you. That just helps clarify kind of where you're coming from, because, and I could tell just energetically from the second of meeting you that you are very embodied in terms of like easy to connect with. Like, you don't seem dissociated from anything beyond like an atheistic kind of like nihilistic worldview. And like you're saying, kind of the deconstructionist, not coming from a place of like judgment, just kind of want to understand you a little bit more and just kind of understand where you're coming from. But the deconstructionist, you share that with Aaron, and that idea of really wanting to just critical analysis of reality. And I love that you mentioned that about truth, because the nature of reality, I think we could add and truth, or and how we find truth based on whatever that perception or that lens of reality or that meaning making. But I wanted to kind of go back to Aaron just for a second and say, what with regards to like astrology and the conversation with maybe people who don't believe it or that believe that it's very limited. Is that, do you think that it's possible to validate astrology to people who don't believe astrology has validity? And it doesn't sound like Ben saying it doesn't have validity, but I just mean like, you were saying like you feel that kind of need to validate it, like with Freud and Jung. And I think that's a really, like a noble thing. Do you think it's possible?
Well, that's a good question. Because, well, there's a lot going on there. And because where I go, I guess, first is like, we're talking about metaphysics. So, and spirituality. And you can't prove those things. But it seems like the sort of the program of astrology essentially is kind of trying to prove those things. Like that's like the whole, in the history of astrology, and it being predictive and it being based on geometry and the planets' relations to one another's and relation to the stars and to the earth orbit, and like with mundane, especially mundane astrology, right? Studying, which is more really the outer planets and their relations to one another, and saying when these aspects form between, Uranus and Neptune, which, Ben, you have the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in your chart. It's a generational thing because the outer planets take so long. But when these particular aspects form in the heavens, right, it corresponds to certain types of events happening on Earth. And so the study of that is sort of saying, look at this. How many times does this have to happen before it's just, and it's just coincidence, So it seems like there is an element of provability, but you have to be open to look at it. You have to be open to looking at it, right? And open to, it's that Aristotle quote, the mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain a thought without accepting it. Well, you have to be willing to entertain the thought. I feel like that's the important piece in that quote, right? If you're not willing to truly entertain something and really think about it as in it may be true, give it the benefit of the doubt before just, that's my rug. You're not gonna, don't piss on it. I'm not gonna let you piss on my rug. Like, I'm not even gonna, entertain the thought. So you're woo and that's it, right? And it's like, well, that type of person, you can't prove it to them, but the thing with astrology is it is so empirical too. You have to experience these synchronicities and you have to see it. And even I'm skeptical still. Like I've talked to you, Susan. I have talked about it on the show. I mean, it's really programming. It's societal, Descartes, Newton, Galileo, materialism, like as in determinism, right? And scientism, and like the only thing that's real is material reality, and that's it. And which I want to go into because that's getting into the Platonism and the Neoplatonism. But to answer your question, I guess, in my Gemini way, that's my quick answer to answer. Did I
Right.
answer? I don't know.
I guess well, that does, and Susan, you can respond to that, but that did make me think of another question to kind of ask maybe you, Susan, and also I'd be interested in your response, Aaron. Like, do we see astrology as like descriptive, like describing kind of natural patterns in the world, or is it inscriptive, right? Do we take these descriptions that we can recognize in the world and do we inscribe them somehow, to like, I think that's some of the conflict I think I've heard you both have in previous, discussions with each other is like, what is the predictability or kind of the inscription that we should take? And is astrology a practice of description or inscription? I guess that would be my question for you both.
Yeah. And Aaron, do you want to answer first?
Yeah, go for it. No,
okay.
Go for it.
So yeah, it kind of ties in, I think, with what you were saying about causality and the very obvious questionability of astrology being of the nature of causality. So, in terms of reality itself, and this applies to astrology as well, because astrology is in some way, it is a lens. It's somewhat of, now I know, like, to also bring in what Aaron is saying is that because of the nature, like with physics and the physics of the material universe, it's not just a philosophical lens, perhaps, right? And I think that's what Kieran LaGrice is saying in the archetypal cosmos, right? I always get the name messed up. But that there is astrology as a meta, kind of as a meta narrative, or that there is a certain, perhaps even evolving, like in our understanding of physics, an evolving understanding of not just, it's like a hybrid, and I won't do it justice because I don't have my notes with me on that particular thing, but it's like that it's not causal, but there's a hybrid aspect to it that is somewhat co-creational. And this gets back into your question around the, you said, what were the two words you said? Inscription. Descriptive. Yeah. I was like, so because I don't, if reality is not a single brute objective thing that we simply observe, which I don't believe it is, and kind of the quantum, our understanding of the quantum field and physics at this point doesn't believe that it is just a thing that we observe, right? That there is a certain kind of interconnected or interrelational aspect to it. So I think that, if reality is co-created through perception and symbolism and our physical body and our culture and our psyche, right, to bring in Jung, and it's like with a background, with the background that we all have in philosophy, symbolic systems do tend to influence me, at least, that reality is not so much of a fixed, but a dynamic process. And so in that way, I would think that inscriptional would be required in order to make it, to fold it into meaning making. Does that, do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. It does bring to mind a few questions about like how we do define reality, because I think like I agree with you in the sense of like reality is like relational, right? But at the same time, I think there are real things that are outside of relational understanding, right? So I think there can be reality without without a mind, so to say. So
I agree with that.
Yeah,
I agree with you there as well. Yeah.
You say
cool.
Yeah.
So
yes, and like I would answer your question, Ben, by saying it's both. It's prescriptive and descriptive, right? And to what level you're willing to engage with it, it's gonna define sort of. It's kind of amorphous in a way like that. Like it can be. It's like with computing, right? You get in what you get out what you put in. If you put shit in, you're gonna get shit out.
Yeah.
But if you put good quality, and so, but with astrology, it's very much about relation, not just like relation. It's a relationship to a logos, okay, which is a good question, and that's one that I have here, right?
Yeah,
it is. Time is relative, right? We know time is relative scientifically, right? So is linguistics relative? So another word I would say, I mean, it's more complicated than that, but the logos is another really word for, can kind of be synonymous with logistic, like with linguistics, right? The logos. A lot of people are going to hear that and they can, the word of God, right? That's what, in our Christianized kind of way, like we think of logos, we think, Bible, but the logos is a Greek word that goes back to, ancient Greece and, or Hellas, as they would have called it. Like I just read about this yesterday. Hellas is the word the Greeks use for their Hellenes, right? Hellenes. Anyway, I'm. There goes that Gemini again.
I think well, that does kind of bring in the idea too, more about reality of like lived experience, and people's experiences are real, but people can have experiences that don't match with reality. Right. So there, you can think, towards the end of our notes here, I know we'll get into entheogens, right? Like plant medicines and stuff. So like these things can change perception, and the perception and the mind experience is real, but perhaps in the real physical sense, that might not be a reality, right? So that kind of does introduce this idea of relational reality. But at the same time, I think we do have to like be sensitive of like, is there, or how do we define reality in this like mind dependent state, right?
So this is a perfect segue sorry, Susan. I got
No,
to.
go
I
ahead.
got to.
There'll be
All right.
time. There'll be time. Go for
Yeah.
it.
Plato. Okay. Aristocles of Athens, right? So everyone knows him as Plato. Platon in Greek is broad, and apparently Plato had really broad shoulders, so he got the nickname Plato, but his name is actually Aristocles of Athens.
Huh.
So this question of and in it's in Platonism, right? So the philosophy that Plato created. And have you heard of Alfred North Whitehead? I'm sure you have been. You had. Have you heard of him? No. Okay.
I don't think so.
Well, I'm gonna have to share some stuff later about him. I just started doing some research on him today because this quote came to my mind for this, because when I was thinking about the show today and like what I was planning to do, and so there's this quote, and I was like, who said this quote? Because I knew it and I didn't know who said it. And apparently Alfred North Whitehead said, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." And that is true. And if you're going to talk about philosophy, it very much means that you are going to have to wrestle with Plato because he's the father of it in the Western tradition, right? Mm-hmm. Plato and Aristotle are the beginning and damn near end of philosophy, and philosophy is a Greek word, and it comes from Plato. Like it's like so any conversation you're going to have about reality and philosophy, if you're going to do the topic justice, you're going to have to talk about Plato. And so, with you talking about prescription and description, I keep hearing you say Plato's two worlds. The worlds of facts and the worlds of truths. Those are the two worlds that compose reality in Platonism. Sorry. Yeah, Platonism. So anyway, Susan, I had to get that out there. Just I want to get the ball rolling in that direction, but like, certainly, what were you going to say?
No, it's okay. I know I'm like being a total disruptor to the to the outline right now, and I know that. So with y'all's Virgo, I know Ben doesn't know what that means, but you both have Virgo. Y'all just keep me in line. Just keep me, be like, no, we got to get back on topic here, but or back to the outline. But the only thing I really wanted to say about that is on the idea of like the relationship to meaning is that if we look at it, and yes, I agree with you about that, Aaron, as far as like Platonic philosophy is such a foundation for, all other philosophers that came after and the understanding through the Western world of what, of reality in a large sense. And so, but, even fast forwarding into like postmodernism and, I've got like the kind of that idea that even like according to Lacan, who I've mentioned before, one of the French theorists, that reality, and this, I don't think this was a new idea, but he was really interested and focused on the idea of the reality that we cannot access directly. And that's not like truth. It's a certain aspect of reality that we can't access because, like you said, Ben, we're inside of brains. And so if there is, something that is outside of that, it's really hard to get to that. And we find its structure or the nature of it through these various, signifiers or, logos, like Aaron mentioned, but that there's always this kind of remainder or beyondness, which Lacan called the real. And it wasn't just like, oh, real versus false, but it's just that like it escapes any kind of explanation or ability to access it directly. So meaning can't be discovered except through that intermediary in some way. I mean, or at least I would at least pose the question or ask the question whether or not you think it's possible. And this is, kind of throwing it out there to either or neither, whichever, if anybody feels called to answer or respond. But like, can we access reality in any way other than through the distorted lens of our own perception? And like you said, it may not be what's actually happening, right? Like if somebody's having a hallucinogenic experience, and they're seeing things and feeling things. And, does it matter if it's real or not? Like, yes, it does in some ways, in some it depends on who's asking, and it depends on like what the focus or why they're having this experience to begin with is, or what made them reach out for the ethnogen to begin with. It's just like their engagement with it is to some extent like highly influential in what meaning they take from it. So I don't know. I guess you'd have to like go to the postmodern question of like, well, yeah, it might not be true, but what is truth? And then of course we're on that merry-go-round.
That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben. Did you want to address that?
Yeah, no, I definitely think we are limited in kind of the lenses that we have. From my perspective, the best thing that we can have towards seeking truth is the scientific method, because it is falsifiable. As long as we're testing these things and we're open to the idea that we could be wrong, that this could be proven wrong. Then we're always searching for truth. So in the scientific worldview, it's kind of like, infinitely getting closer to truth, but you can maybe never quite get to the truth because we'll never have like a fully objective perspective on anything. So in many ways, it is relational to our, lenses or our normativity. But through these kind of like abstract, tools that we have, like science, the scientific method, or math, even, we can have these like searches or tools for testing, reality in that sense. But when you get into the mind state, and these like metaphysical realities, that's where obviously, we are 100% limited by what we as humans have for, whether it be, our observational skills, our knowledge base, whether that be like physics, quantum, mechanics, whatever. So we are limited in these ways. But I still think that using tools to, pursue objective truth in ways that are falsifiable is kind of our best method towards like seeking those like truths or reality, I guess you could say.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
Plato would say that those are the world, that what you're talking about is the world of facts, materiality.
Yeah. Sure.
Whereas what the other thing you're trying to say is like, okay, but so what science is trying to do, scientism, right? Or just science, scientism wants to do is to make everything fit into that world of facts, and disregards the world of truths. So only what fits in the world of facts can be true. So, and when you were talking, Ben, I had this thought, or this idea came to mind, that what science has is a factoscope, right? It doesn't have a truthoscope, right? So in other words, it can look at all the facts of material reality. That's what science does, and that's what it's good for. But it can't look but it can't then define the truths about those facts. Okay, and so there's a good thought experiment here to kind of get at the difference between facts and truths. And John Michael Greer, this is from an essay that he wrote in a volume called Ascendant, and it's a volume that's about polytheism with different authors. But here's the idea: 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, all right. Is that a fact or is that a truth? All right. So Plato would say it's a truth, right? And here's why. Because 1 + 1 clearly = 2, right? But if you take two apples, 1 + 1, and you have two different apples, one's red, one's green, one's a little bit bigger, one's a little bit smaller, does that equal 2? Does 1 + 1 = 2 if you're talking about two different apples? Well, if you're talking about the factual, no, actually, it doesn't equal 2. One's a little bigger than the other one, right? One tastes different than the other one. You're going to like the way one tastes more than you're going to like the way another one tastes. So 1 + 1 may equal 2.5 because of the value that's being assigned. And that value is not a value. It's not factual, right? It's experiential. That's the truth of the fact. The truth of it is 1 + 1 = 2. That exists in the new sphere, though. That's like number is form, right? It's perfect in that way. And Plato would say, right, that everything in reality that we experience is a reflection of the new sphere, of the world of truth. It's a reflection of that, but it's not a perfect reflection. So I don't know. What does that do anything for you?
I mean, the Apple thing definitely hurts my brain. I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand that, because it seems like you jumped from like mathematical truths to like semantic, like nuance,
Well, this is
which
Plato
I would say is
talking.
kind of like, but that would be like a categorical error, right? Because if we're talking about like numerology, and then we go to like material items with extra nuance, I think that would just come down to like language, right? And I actually saw this really good talking about like meta ethic, a really good example talking about apples even. It was the description of a yumple, right? So a yumple is a tasty apple, right? Now I could say I have 2 yumples, right? But if I give you both one of my yumples and you taste it and you don't like the yumple, all of a sudden to you, this yumple would just be an apple, right?
Right.
So there is that relative, but that I think is coming back into the like rhetoric and our use of language, right? And the nuance there. Whereas what we're talking about when we're using math is mathematical truths.
Yes.
These are like how we measure, things, right? So I guess like I would be interested like in how we're using, and maybe we go back to Plato here, but like how we're using truth versus, fact.
Well, let me put
because
it,
like obviously yeah.
So Plato would, and again, facts would be known by the senses, and then truths would be known by the mind. So there's a distinction.
I don't know. That makes me uncomfortable.
Well, I dropped out of college, so I mean, and I didn't study.
By the mind. So wait, one more time. Truth and
facts are known by the senses. In other words, the factoscope, right, that we have, right, to distinguish what is real. But
so by your own lens, you could have different truths.
So truths are going to be known by the mind. But see, here's the thing, though, right? With our factoscope that we have as humans, okay, we know that the brain is reducing the factual sensory information that we have to work with. We know this scientifically. So it's really not saying anything that's counter to our scientific understanding of consciousness at this point.
Yeah, I think, I guess maybe I get uncomfortable with this because it seems like this is going into kind of like subjectivism, which I think we agreed upon in some ways. Like there are realities that are subjective, right? Like speaking of the like mind independence, of reality, but also that, there is the sort of objective reality that we can measure. So I feel like using that, definition of fact, we could come to, all sorts of different facts that we couldn't resolve, in any meaningful way. But like, I guess that also does undermine the idea that you could have a different truth than I could have a different truth. So I think it's almost like nuanced in the sense of like context, right? Because there could be like subjective truths that I experience, but there might not be objective truths that we all agree upon, or maybe there are objective truths, but we cannot agree upon.
Well, there's objective
right?
facts.
So okay. But see, the definition of facts that we're using would be mind dependent. So there aren't objective facts.
You're saying it
would be mind dependent. Because objectivity is mind independent.
Well, and that's a good question, because does reality exist outside of our conception of reality?
Right.
And you couldn't prove that, right? That's the sound of one hand clapping.
Well, I think that goes back to like my definition of reality in the search for it in the scientific worldview, right? It's like there might be objective truths that we could reach towards with our tools, whether that be measuring, certain celestial events or whatever it may be. We can draw these realities into our frameworks, right? And apply like a truth reality to that. And there's nothing that would be mind dependent in those systems, because those are objective measurements that we can make, that we can agree upon. We can test them and verify them as non-falsifiable, right? But when we're talking about like experiences and the truth of experiences, we can't falsify those, because there's no way to test a mind dependent truth like that, because you would just say any truth that a mind has is that truth. So we kind of eliminate the idea of like some sort of objective truth, which maybe that would be fine in certain contexts using rhetorically. But I think when we start applying that truth outside of like mind experience, I think we get into maybe potentially like concerning areas, and that's where my like ethical skepticism would come into it. Because if we're saying that these truths are mind dependent, and we can't agree upon some truth, then the implications of that ethically are pretty concerning, at least from my perspective and my understanding of different frameworks. But yeah, no, that's interesting, the difference of truth and like reality and fact. Yeah, I don't know.
So can I ask you then, let me ask, because this is kind of coming up for me. So do you think that, and this is for both of you, but kind of responding to what you're saying, Ben, do you think that reality, where is meaning located then in this kind of scientific method, or this approach that it relies largely on the scientific method for truth? Or am I misunderstanding that? Like that, in terms of what is real, that if it is measurable by, does it sort of exclude what is, it excludes anything that doesn't like hold up to that scientific method as being unreal in some way, or invalidated? Or like, how does the nature of like meaning change based on that that standard?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would still hold to the idea of like meaning being relational, right? And meaning would be another thing that we could draw as like mind dependent,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't really have an idea of meaning without some sort of agency or knowledge or mind dependent. So yeah, I would think meaning would still come from your different lenses, and your like experiences and your knowledge. So you could still draw meaning from that. But in the scientific worldview, or in the scientific method, you're pursuing these truths through testable means, right? So I would come up with an experiment to test these means and try to falsify my hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be the route. You can still draw meaning from your discoveries in the scientific method, whether you falsify, a hypothesis or a belief, or if you verify.
Right.
And in the scientific method, each verification gets you closer to the truth, but you might not, in an objective reality, be able to come to an absolute truth on these things. But through the scientific process, we can come to the closest truth, value that we could, in a sense, at least through that framework.
Gotcha. So like for personal, if there are like, assuming, and maybe you agree with this, maybe you don't, I don't want to make any assumptions, but like if reality is multi-layered, right? If, and I guess that's a whole nother question, but if reality is not exhausted only by what can be measured, if, in other words, if our reality, if there is more to reality than what can be measured, I guess that would be, do we all agree on that?
Oh,
In
yeah.
terms of measured
Yeah, I mean,
by a scientific. Okay. And so then then consciousness, which kind of comes in, which I think is like assumed, right? That we're always working on consciousness or trying to understand consciousness. But like that there isn't a way to reduce consciousness to a scientific inquiry or to validate consciousness using the scientific method? Or do you think that you can?
I think we're definitely pursuing that. And this is where I would say that it's like, especially in religious discussions, a lot of people will, it's called like God of the gaps, right? Like if we don't understand something, or maybe we don't have a form to measure like a soul or whatever it may be, just throwing God in kind of like feels like a solution.
Right.
But when we don't have these means to measure it, it doesn't, give us justification to make these leaps. So, just because we don't have an understanding completely of how consciousness and neurobiology works,
Right.
doesn't mean we should like make assumptions. So, but I would definitely say that, emerging neuroscience, the study on, animals, brains and human brains, is definitely progressing to a point where we're beginning to start to understand the evolutionary basis for consciousness, but also the pure biological mechanisms for how consciousness is currently operating. There's huge gaps still. I'm not saying that science is like super clear on that, but it is something that is being pursued. And I know y'all have talked about AI a little bit as well. There is also the field of, emergent AI. And you mentioned embodiment of AI. That's actually happening now. You should probably check that out if you're interested. There is embodiment of AI. So that kind of consciousness bridge is starting to be filled as well. But yeah, I would say definitely consciousness is, built on top of biological reality. And therefore, just because it's like a complex system doesn't mean that we could just say, oh, it's unexplainable. It's just like not explainable right now based on like the information or tools that we have, I would say.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of to the same point around, because we can't fill in gaps with our imagination and necessarily think, or what might be imagination, right? Like for example, God is the example you used, right? Like we're kind of filling that in, even though, because we don't really, we want to understand, we want there to be, we want to close the loop on that. But just as much as we don't have the information, we can't also say, and again, this kind of goes to like the cliche argument, though, we can't make assumptions that there isn't, right? Because we just don't know. And so kind of to the agnostic idea, there's if we need a hard definitive for some of those things that we're still evolving as a species, and like you just illustrated very beautifully with the examples, then a lot more still has to be revealed, and we're learning, but is there really a purpose in having to define what the unknown actually is before either worldview, to break it into binaries, although I know it's much more complicated than that, but, is there a need to have an answer of whether there is or there isn't? Does that matter? And does it matter for astrology? Does it matter for, finding meaning in any kind of philosophical system versus, in other words, Ben, would you try to apply the scientific method? Because from my understanding, I've given up, I think astrology loses if you try to make it, if you try to push, if you want to be like, you want to have a sense of belonging in the scientific world as an astrology loses that battle. It just does, because you can't, and to me, that's just my opinion, and from like a lot of debates and arguments that astrologers have been having with, scientists for a long time. But does that matter? Does it have to? It's kind of like, can you prove psychology? Like, what is, what are some other things that would like be outside of the realm of valid or having value, because it kind of, the same thing with the apples, what are they called? The yumples.
Oh, the yupple. Yeah, yupple.
Like if something isn't good for you, if it doesn't taste good to you, like if astrology doesn't resonate, just like if depth psychology doesn't resonate, or, there's such a multiplicitous way of understanding and having personal fulfillment. Where does personal fulfillment come in? If it isn't rooted in something that is philosophical, but also possibly, does have a certain relationship to causality, even though it isn't being, astrology isn't being caused by the science. And I think that quantum mechanics is really interesting too, as far as like a place of possible bridging, but there's a lot I still have to learn about that. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now.
Well, that inevitably comes up, as it should, and it has become cliche, but the fact remains, when we look with our factoscope, it changes what is actually happening. Right? I mean, when we know that by observing reality changes due to that observation.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, I want to ask you, Ben, because I feel like you're using the word, at least in a Platonic sense, you're using the word truth interchangeably with facts.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out,
because
that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out, that gap, like in my mind, like,
so let me ask you,
what is the truth and what is the fact?
Yeah. Okay, so fair enough, because like that's what I want to know, like from you. Like, I want to know from you, what is the difference between a fact and a truth, and or is there a difference? Because that is fundamental. And the thing is,
yeah, I am too.
Let me say one other thing about that. Because I've read this in my studies on Platonism and Neoplatonism, and that what the scientific revolution did was reverse the order of operations platonically. Okay, so because Plato would have said that his perfect forms or ideas, right, the perfect ideas or perfect forms, are in fact the source of the world of facts, and that material things, right, are actually imperfect reflections of those mental truths. So what science did essentially was flip that around, right, and say, no, facts are the things that are real, and truths evolve out of those facts and are therefore like they're subject to subjectivity, right? The truth is like, it's relative to the objective. Okay, but Plato said it was the other way around, right? He said that the perfect ideas, which are improperly reflected, like they're not perfectly reflected down here in reality, right? But he's saying the perfect thing is the idea, not the actual like physical manifestation. And that everything that is like, there's a dog that exists, there's all kinds of all these dogs, right? They're all trying to be the perfect dog that exists in the noosphere, right? That exists as a perfect idea. Just like 1 + 1 = 2. That's perfect. But in reality, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2 if we're talking about subjectivity. So I'll give the floor back to you. I just want to point out that what happened with the scientific revolution is that the Platonic order of things was reversed.
Interesting. Yeah, I've not really considered that idea, to be honest. But like, I'll have to think on it more, because like we talked about, there can be mind-dependent truths, and then there are like objective truths potentially that you could argue. But then to me, like a fact is like 1 + 1 is 2, or like the wavelength for red is whatever. Those would be like objective facts, but in my rhetoric, I would also consider those a truth value as well. So true to me just means like yes, or it is ontologically a thing. So I'll have to explore that more. I mean, that's an interesting idea. But trying to go back. So Susan, I think you had mentioned like the bigger picture of like how we would find, I guess, meaning. Was it meaning, or maybe you can kind of rephrase your question?
Kind of like personal fulfillment and meaning. If that if reality has these different layers, the material and the metaphysical, kind of the metaphysical certainty as a like of the material reality is like but one layer, right? And perhaps if there's a psychological layer, if there's a symbolic layer, cultural, if we have these different aspects of reality, that none of them alone kind of paint the picture, but they all work together to to kind of help humans to orient themselves meaningfully within their lives or within their perception of reality. It's like, then what if there's, where do you find that with the focus or the emphasis on finding like truth within the material reality, or metaphysical certainty? It's like, what does that do? How does that inform your fulfillment or your understanding of like what your life means, if you want to put it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, kind of deconstructing was one of the most powerful things for my meaning, and finding meaning in life. I mean, for me, as somebody who's obsessed with seeking truth, I think that is my meaning, to seek truth and
Mm.
to seek deeper understanding and acquire more knowledge, and do that compassionately and, try to use logic, because I love logic and I try to be like a computer, at least when I'm analyzing, logistical things. So I think, assigning like self-determination and, assigning your own purpose is extremely, extremely important, in my framework. And I definitely wouldn't like discount any of those other frameworks like culture or anything like that.
Mhm.
But I think what I would say is like, all of those lenses or frameworks that we add personally, we have to be open to like introspection and criticism on those frameworks, right? And I think, especially from my foundation in the scientific worldview, like that is the very essence of science, is like trying to tell me I'm wrong. Like I want you to prove I'm wrong,
Yeah.
right? Like that's the entire basis of science, and that to me is like the foundation is is how we should be seeking truth.
Mhm.
Now, when we start to add in these other layers, like cultural layers, historical context, etc., those are lenses that we should 100% be applying into these things. But when they become, I guess, unquestionable, or an absolute truth, I think that's where we get into, positions of concern, at least for me as a skeptic, because I think if we're not being open to having those lenses challenged, and reassessing them, then we're doing a disservice to the truth ultimately, at least from my framework. So yeah, I think we can definitely still pursue our own purpose and truths, outside of maybe different frameworks that try to guide us towards a certain truth, and maybe dogmatically or non-dogmatically. So I definitely think in my worldview that being able to like step back, kind of reassess and challenge, my perspectives is extremely important to me, in seeking my own truth and finding reality.
Right. Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. If I can say, that's really cool. Thank you for sharing that. I think what you're speaking to is really interesting, because it's also the Socratic method, to throw back to the Greeks again. I mean, that is in a sense what we're doing when we're trying to have the dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, right? Like the willingness to work with polarities, and be able to find that synthesis within. If we don't have that, then we're not in any kind of dialectic that is going to take us closer to truth. And we fall back on the dogma, like you said, and the rigidity of don't pee on my rug. So, I think that's really refreshing to hear you say that. And, yeah. So there was more I was going to say and I forgot it. I lost it, but
So
yeah.
I'll jump in then and sort of progress the conversation a little bit into Neoplatonism,